with week 8 almost in the books as we record this on Monday. Week 9 is on the horizon. No better time to get a DFS early look than right now. So sit down, hit subscribe, and lock in for the DFS early look.
What?
Why are you shaking your head?
You're welcome.
Every passing week, it feels like one of our favorite wide receivers gets hurt for a long period of time. This week, so far, shaping up to be no different potentially, but that just means there are more and more players to sift through to find the edges we need to build the best lineups. And boy, do we have some fun ones today. Of course, I'm hosting this here program. I'm Thomas Tipple. The man writing the article with all the information, that's Jake Tribbey himself. That's at Jake Tribbey. We have, of course, a painful look with the first player that we look. Obviously, if you watched Cashing Points on Friday, you would have seen and heard us talk about Jameis Winston and everyone else on the Cleveland Browns. We're starting it off again. DraftKings, again, slow catching up to big performances. We talk about this all the time. QB20, Jameis Winston. Let's break my heart again.
Yeah, Winston absolutely balled out in his first start. He threw for 334 yards, 3 touchdowns, and he scored 27.6 DraftKings points in an upset win over Baltimore. I don't think anyone was more upset than Thomas when that happened, but this is exactly what we expected and had been hoping for. The combination of Cleveland's hyper-aggressive offensive play calling, their top 5 in pass rate over expectation, and their pace, they run the 8th most plays per game, leads to an awesome fantasy environment when a real NFL quarterback is under center. Winston has provided a serious spark here, and neither DFS site significantly raised his price heading into week 9. Now, Winston gets a neutral matchup with the Chargers, priced as one of the cheapest starting quarterbacks on either site. And there's no reason Winston should be priced under $6K on DraftKings after Joe Flacco averaged 24.4 DraftKings fantasy points per game in this offense last season. Winston's simply a great play and a great value in week 9.
Probably going to be one of the top plays every week, I imagine. Let's talk about running backs, a position I talk about being the most important for your lineups every single week to get them right. Alvin Kamara had a pretty good week here last week and gets what should be a nut matchup, or what I personally thought Javonte had as a nut matchup. Didn't totally work out that way. But RB4 at 7,800, let's talk about Alvin.
Yeah, so Kamara did have a solid game in the box score, but he did end up being a victim of poor game script and general offensive incompetency in week 8. Now, that said, even though New Orleans could barely reach the red zone, I mean, they really couldn't do anything, Kamara still finished with a top 10 running back workload on the week, and he just played 5 snaps in the fourth quarter. So things went horrifically wrong. Kamara still got a top 10 workload, but week 9 looks much better. Derek Carr could suit up, and either way, New Orleans is favored by 7 points against the Panthers. Kamara, historically, 25% more productive in wins and 57% more productive on a per-snap basis when leading since the 2022 season. Now, on top of favorable game script, Carolina is the single softest schedule-adjusted matchup for opposing running backs. If there was ever a get-right spot for Kamara and the New Orleans offense, it would be against the league's worst defense by points per game allowed in the last 20 years.
Yes, and our next player was predicted to be the Dolphins wide receiver 2 by our own Ryan Heath, and Tua comes back and immediately takes possibly the wide receiver 1 role. I don't know. But DraftKings, again, slow to bounce back. RB12 getting dynamite action on Devon Achane. Let's talk about him and the matchup versus Buffalo.
Yeah, Achane averages 21.6 expected fantasy points per game and 26.4 actual fantasy points per game in his games with Tua Tagovailoa this season. Now, over the full year, those marks would both rank first among running backs, and yet Achane is being treated as a low-end RB1 on both DFS sites. Now, there's a strong argument that with Tagovailoa under center, Achane is the most valuable running back in fantasy football, and he's a great chance to prove it this week. Buffalo is a top 3 on paper matchup for opposing running backs, primarily because they've allowed the third most schedule adjusted receiving fantasy production to running backs. Now, Achane averages an absurd 17.2 receiving fantasy points per game with Tagovailoa under center this season. That would rank 9th best among wide receivers. No one benefits from Tagovailoa's return more than Devon Achane, and his DFS price just doesn't reflect it.
Truly insane. Still don't know why they are so late to adjust prices, but yet here we are continuing to benefit. Let's move on to wide receivers, and with the running backs being cheap enough, it feels like we can really power load some wide receivers. And we're going to start it off with someone that our own Scott Barrett thinks is the wide receiver one in fantasy the rest of the way. Let's talk about AJ Brown, especially versus Jacksonville, only priced as the wide receiver 3. Seems insane.
Yeah, so Brown's usage hasn't been truly elite. It's lagged a bit behind some other elite wide receivers, but he's still the wide receiver 2 by actual fantasy points per game. And he really might not need much volume in week 9 to post a monster score, as he's facing a Jacksonville pass defense that ranks as the 3rd softest schedule adjusted matchup for opposing wide receivers. Now that's great, but on top of ranking bottom 3 in receiving yards per game allowed and passer rating allowed, the Jaguars are allowing by far the most receiving yards per game on deep throws. A.J. Brown, meanwhile, has scored 49% of his fantasy points this season on just deep targets. The only risk here is that Philadelphia wins in such dominant fashion that they really don't need to push the ball downfield to Brown. But even so, this Jacksonville secondary is so bad that he remains a great bet for tournaments in what is truly a perfect matchup.
He's going to go nuclear. I truly believe that. Speaking of going absolutely nuclear, it turns out we just might have a Nico Collins style breakout happening with Winston throwing the football. Let's talk about Cedric Tillman, the man from Tennessee, tearing it up right now at an insane pace. And we've mentioned it a few times. He's only wide receiver 54 because the market's just slow to rebound.
Yeah, these DFS prices can be quite slow to rebound, especially on DraftKings. Tillman has played 2 games without Deshaun Watson and Amari Cooper, and he's averaged 10.5 targets per game, 19.7 expected fantasy points per game, and 23.5 actual fantasy points per game in those contests. Now, over the whole season, those marks would all rank top 5 among wide receivers. I don't expect Cedric Tillman to maintain top 5 wide receiver production or usage for the remainder of the season, but his role is so much better than his DFS salaries that it obviously warrants mention. The matchup here is a slight negative. Now, the Chargers are a bottom 10 schedule adjusted matchup for outside wide receivers, but honestly, that just doesn't matter when Tillman's price is so absurdly low relative to the volume that he's been seeing, especially with Jameis Winston.
It's an opportunity to see if the breakout is truly legit or if it's just some favorable situations. But again, price so low, hard to miss. Let's finish this week off here with a tight end selection, and everyone in this receiving room seems to be banged up except for the tight end in Jacksonville, priced seemingly accordingly at tight end 4. Let's talk about Evan Engram.
Yeah, so Engram is basically the last man standing in Jacksonville. Christian Kirk is lost for the season. Brian Thomas Jr. and Gabe Davis both look fairly questionable after getting beat up on Sunday. We don't have much info on Gabe Davis, Brian Thomas Jr. Things are still, in flux as we record. But, I should note, Engram is already one of the most utilized tight ends in fantasy football. If we just look at his games since he returned from injury, he ranks 2nd among tight ends in expected fantasy points per route run and 3rd in targets per route run. If Jacksonville is without 52% of their targets on Sunday, or even just without Christian Kirk, Engram will be forced into one of the most valuable tight end roles in the NFL. And then we can tack on extreme negative game script with Jacksonville listed as a 7-point underdog here. I mean, the path to double-digit targets for Evan Engram is clearly wide open this week.
A clear opportunity for a week-winning slate here for Evan Engram. If you want the full article, you can get that at FantasyPoints.com. If you are watching this on Tuesday, I will have the link in the description for you here. Otherwise, you need to be locked in, subscribed. If you are not subscribed for any reason, maybe you just hate making sums of money, I don't know. You can use promo code YouTube25 to get 25% off an already discounted subscription. It really is almost as close as you can get to printing free money. Of course, I love this show every single week, giving you the earliest look at the DFS slate that you can get. For Jake Tribbey, I'm Thomas Tipple. We'll see you guys next week right here for the DFS Early Look.